Hello everyone, it's Lien Yeung with CBC News and BC Now. Welcome back. So, our segment's called BC Now. We like to do things now, immediately. And we've got a piece that's rolling out tonight in our 6 o'clock news. We're going to give you the big debut right now if you stick around. So it's a really interesting story that one of my colleagues from the CBC Indigenous Youth spent months working on, and it took her down to the state, into the interior. It's about a group of First Nations that at one point the Canadian government thought was extinct, but they are very much not so. They are here, they are around, and they want their voices heard, and there is a very, very large and major negotiation that's happening right now in our province that's set to happen actually even across the border over the span of the next possibly years to come that I don't think a lot of people know about. I certainly didn't. And her story is going to walk us through all of that, and then she's actually going to come in and talk to us as well. So first of all, I think we'll all watch the story, the debut of the piece. Mark, please roll the tape.
These kinds of things are important for your children's future, your grandchildren's future.
Shelley Boyd had most of her life advocating for the Sinixt and is the language and culture teacher in Inchulum. Almost all the kids who go here are Sinixt, even though they live only an hour away from the Canadian border. Most of them have never been on their traditional territory. Boyd's is located in one of the poorest counties in Washington, and crossing the border is always so simple.
They found gold in Republic, and then now we're down here. So we're not on our traditional story anymore.
For a lot of these students, this is the first time hearing about the Columbia River Treaty, and they don't understand they're being left out.
So I think we shouldn't be recognized as Justins if we come from Canadian land as well.
We should also get kind of a big say in it too, because it was ours to begin with.
The Columbia River Treaty is being renegotiated right now. The BC says it can't bring the Sinixt to the negotiating table. The Colville Confederated Tribes represents the Sinixt and are already engaged with U.S. negotiators. BC says bringing the Sinixt in could jeopardize Canada's negotiating position and place the Sinixt in a conflict of interest.
It doesn't make any sense. The United States would never do anything with land in Canada, and that's where our territory is. So how would the United States represent us in Canada?
As long as our culture shows the headwaters of the Columbia all the way down to Kettle Falls, that's where it is. And so, that's how important it is. I don't think we can distinguish Sinixt, separate the Columbia River.
Stevie Seymour is Sinixt, and she is dedicated to raising her culture. She says now is the time for Canada to right wrongs against the Sinixt, while the Columbia River Treaty is being created.
Canada talks about truth and reconciliation while sweeping, and it's over and over again.
80% of traditional territory is in Canada, covering the minimum of the Columbia River. In the 1880s, when the Indian agent came through Sinixt's land, he missed them, which meant no reserve was set up. As a result, Sinixt were displaced across their territory, and hundreds moved into the U.S. Scott, their reserve, was established on the western shore of Arrow 1902. Only 26 people moved there, now underwater. The last registered person on the reserve, Annie, died in 1953. 3 years later, Canada and the U.S. had formal discussions that would become the Columbia River Treaty. Canada was already clearing land in the interior of the flooded. The treaty's purpose was for year-round electricity and flood control, with a series of dams and reservoirs. That same year, Canada declared the Sinixt extinct. Many historians and Sinixt say this isn't a coincidence.
We have been removed from Canada. That is the complete genocide.
The treaty was signed in 1970 and ratified 3 years later.
The treaty we proclaim will lay a new foundation of prosperity for Canadians and for your West and for ours.
The U.S. just over $64 million took floods for 60 years. But come September 4, that agreement expires, leaving either side to make changes to the treaty or even terminate it. For the last years, talks have been underway about these renegotiations. And Canada has been consulting with the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, and Syilx Okanagan nations, but not the Sinixt.
Nothing's happening. Instead, they're working to make sure that we're not included, that in 2024 this is signed without one Sinixt voice saying anything.
The Sinixt moved near Kettle, Washington, but when gold was found there, they were forced to move again to nowhere near their traditional territory.
Our home isn't a country. Our home is the Columbia River.
In 2021, the Supreme Court told the Sinixt is an Aboriginal people of Canada and were not extinct. It meant that the Sinixt is entitled to Section 35 of the Constitution. Section 35 and affirms the rights of Indigenous peoples, which include duty to consult.
They're acting like we don't exist, but courts have said we do. The courts have confirmed we're Aboriginal people of Canada. What does that mean?
It's hard to know how much tribes are getting in the U.S. The State Department confirmed the tribe members' non-disclosure agreements to ensure confidentiality of the negotiation. The chairman of the Colville Confederated Tribes confirmed with CBC that Canada had not reached out to them about the negotiations. The BC government acknowledges the Columbia River Treaty caused harm to First Nations. It talks about the damage flooding caused to First Nations land, fish, habitat artifacts, but doesn't say which First Nations it's referring to.
The surest sign I have of how significant this is that the Canadian government and the BC government relentlessly refused to allow the Sinixt to be at the negotiating table. And I think that's the first clue that we're sitting on a really cool moment here.
Eileen Delahanty Perks has written book Columbia River Treaty and the Sinixt. She has reviewed documents that prove the BC government knowingly flooded land with graves and that 90% of archaeological sites in lakes were destroyed. Says there was a huge rush to build these dams because the U.S. offered Canada bonuses if they completed early.
It was just greed in the end that caused them to and allow these cultural sites to be flooded without preservation.
The river is essentially liquid gold. The treaty between the U.S. and Canada is there to ensure that every drop of water is being managed. Hydropower alone, the Columbia generates billions of dollars. It provides nearly 50% of BC's power and 40% of all U.S. hydroelectric power.
There's something very powerful going on when you take an extremely power system worth billions of dollars and you expose a truth about the lack of ethics, a truth in that process.
One other aspect in the renegotiations is the fish have huge cultural significance to First Nations and tribes all along the river. Large dams in the U.S. have salmon from accessing 40% of their natural. Restoring the salmon to the Upper Columbia and repairing the ecosystem is a priority for DR Michelle.
Let's start to do those we need to do to correct some of those historic wrongs and make this a better place for all of us, future generations, for the benefit of all.
Recently, the administration made a commitment, more than $200 million over 20 years to the Upper Columbia to reintroduce salmon to the river. Michelle says his parents were the last people in his family to see salmon at Kettle Falls. Right? Future generations will see salmon return to the river.
we can have production, we can have flood risk management, we can have our fish back. We can afford that. It doesn't have to be a fight over.
Unless Canada opens the door, and because of the digital, the Sinixt only recourse may be legal action.
They have the same legal tools available to kind of force the government to the table that a group situation in Canada would. And that's the key takeaway. There's no higher legal bar, a group in the United States, than there is in Canada.
But when the duty applies in an international treaty is tricky. According to Brent, haven't resolved if the government has a duty to consult during the phase. He says that may be purely a political matter and for the courts to decide.
Even if it's legally unclear whether or not it has to do it, there's nothing stopping the government from consulting from engaging nations in the table if they think it's a good idea to do.
When the new treaty is implemented into Canadian law, this would likely be where the duty to consult is triggered. For Seymour, though, she says Sinixt should be consulted now.
Ideally, what would happen is Canada and the other tribes would say, hey, you know what, you have blocked. You have been wronged here. And welcome to the table.
Negotiations will end in a matter of months. Who is to benefit and how the power of the Columbia will be harnessed for the decades is still to be decided. Jackie McKay for CBC in Washington State.
And that voice that you just on that lovely piece, Jackie McKay, who is now in studio with me for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is great. So super interesting. How did it come about? How did it even come to you?
I heard about the Columbia River Treaty and I was trying to understand it a little bit more. And originally my idea was I just wanted to know, like, are the First Nations being consulted? Like, what
are not being consulted?
Yeah, or like, and I saw that the Tanaha, Secwepemc, and Silgogan had formally been invited to sit in on the negotiation. Okay, but like, where are the Sinixt? Like, I know the Sinixt territories, like Revels, Washington. Like, that's right on the Columbia. Where are they? And so I started those questions and reaching out to people, and that's kind of when I learned that they're there at all.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so let's just pull up this. I thought that map that you used was really interesting because, there we go. This is the map. So, like a whole chunk of land, their ancestral territory is actually in Canada, but they don't actually, they're not really there now.
Yeah.
So maybe you can kind of show us what that looks like.
Yeah, this map actually is the last map the BC government had where the Sinixt territory is in, so that's why we kind of used it.
Yeah.
Some people don't agree with this, but this is kind of what we have. So in the middle there where it says lakes and sailor, that's where the Sinixt traditional land is. Yeah, so it's like most and then you can kind of see the border there, and then in Washington just like a bit is the U.S. part of the border where the Sinixt being pushed into and settled in that region. And, like, you know, the border became more of a thing. It was harder to move across. People ended up staying there, and because the Sinixt didn't originally get a reservation, there was people were kind of displaced. They were moving into other nations across BC. A lot of people in Washington ended up staying there. And so then when the Sinixt were declared wrongfully extinct, even though there was Sinixt Canada, there was Sinixt, hundreds of Sinixt in Washington.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how many were there, because I mean, I saw you said there was 26 that moved into that one in Oatscott.
Yeah, so Oatscott, it was...
what's the population?
I don't have an exact number. Because I saw for around that time, it was over 400 in Washington, and then we don't really know. Some people moved into the other stations, so I'm not quite sure in BC, but like hundreds of people still alive. They weren't extinct.
Yes.
They were never extinct.
Clearly. And you know, we heard from, I believe her name was, she was one of the elders and the teachers of those those
Shelley, yeah.
Shelley, yes, Shelley. And then we also heard from some of these really interesting because you were there for a special moment, like some of the first time that they heard about their traditional territories and some of the challenges that they faced. Well, what's it like for them through that moment?
Yeah, and I think it's important for them to be heard because it's kind of a drive home, like why does any of this matter? Like they're still Sinixt. They're living outside traditional territory. They were pushed even outside of that. Their reservation is on land on their traditional territory.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they care about land in Canada? And I think people like Shelley decision are like trying to bring people home, and they want to be part of Canada and like have additional land because it's important to them. They're good for the land. It's good for their. They want to be welcomed back, but it's something and as like a border in that colonial structure, it doesn't make sense in the context because they're transboundary. And if you think of indigeneity as transboundary, it's hard those parameters of something, as rigid as like an international treaty negotiation and like being American, but like in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. Did you hear anything from those teens about what it's like, living so far from what's really actually your home? And like you said, that matters. Knowing where you come from matters.
Yeah, and I think like all of them know the history of the extinction and where they come from, and want to get back there. And they like when I was explaining the treaty, and it was a lot of them, like until lots of us don't even know about the Columbia River Treaty, let alone living in America and you're 15 years old. Yeah. We were talking about it, they were just like, well, this sounds really unfair. Why would we not be included in something that directly has impacted us? Yeah. And I think that's the question I'm trying to ask is, like, why shouldn't we include the Sinixt? Reports have said they're an Aboriginal people of Canada, and like as Shelley puts it, like what mean?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question you raise. And there's a quote that was used in your piece I thought was actually really powerful. Mark, if you could put that up. I think for me it really kind of drove home what's this.
It was just greed in the end that caused them to look away and all these cultural sites to be flooded without preservation.
So she says it's ultimately about greed. Like, how much money are we talking about that's at stake? I mean, you gave some of the stats, which were astounding. I had no idea. Like, 40% of all of the U.S.'s hydropower based on this dam.
Yeah, not just like that dam. It's all of the tributaries across the Columbia River. So there's like, in the States too, the tributaries of the Columbia, it's like, we're over 300 dams. Wow. We have just a couple in Canada, but the ones in Canada are holding water so we don't like wash away Portland.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so it's like, I talked to Eileen about, I was like, how much money are we talking about? And she was like, I don't know how to quantify it. We're talking billions of dollars in hydropower alone, let alone like the cities we could wash out if we weren't storing that water, and then the costs environmentally and like culturally to tribes and First Nations along that river. It's like, how do you quantify that even? So not only is there huge amounts of money still involved, which I think is like a huge part of this negotiation, but like there's also just like really cultural significance of this river and of the environment. So there's a lot at stake for everybody who kind of has their hands in this.
Right. And so what do the Sinixt want at the end of all of this? Like, do they have an idea, kind of like, what they think would be a fair deal for them if they were to be involved in the negotiations?
It's hard exactly to say. Like, I think we talk about in the piece, like, the land, like restoration of the land. If we lower there's a lot of what is actually up for negotiation is just like water levels. And so even if you lower some of those water levels, you can restore the environment. Like a lot of Sinixt graves and archaeological sites were flooded. Right. Their only land ever given to them by Canada is underwater. When they made that dam we showed.
Oatscott?
Yeah, Oatscott, it's like, it's submerged. Not that Oatscott really means a lot to some of the Sinixt, but like there is still history there, and that was lost. And I think fish passage is huge, but I think it's not less about like what you get out of the deal and more about what does the government with this history tied to the Sinixt, like what do we owe them? Like what does reconciliation look like knowing this? And if we have politicians who say that their relationships to Indigenous people are important, why aren't we doing anything to right some of the historic wrongs that happened in this treaty?
And that was part of your big takeaway after spending months on this, hey?
Yeah, was it because it's less about what the government needs to do. It's more about what should they do. And I think that's a lot about what we're like kind of the movement we're going in Canada. Like when it comes to legislation, in Canada too, there's like, you don't necessarily have to consult the First Nations it's impacting, but we do oftentimes because it's the right thing to do. So I think the question I want people to take away from this is like, what is the right thing to do with the Sinixt? Like, what do we owe them?
Right,
and
especially if we're talking about reconciliation, right?
Exactly. So I think by a start is reconciling the history of this treaty and the impact it has had on the Sinixt, and start to think of them less as in America, and you know, what does it mean to welcome them home? How do we move to a place where we're consulting and working with the Sinixt?
Right. Well, thank you for your work on this. I think you gave us a big part of that truth and actually understanding what the story is, because I think a lot of us, and myself included, don't actually know. So, Jackie, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us about your piece and for that great reporting.
Thank you for having me.